welcome back. This is Chicken Philosophy, and I'm your host for today, Edward, and this is Meccan Revelations, part 25, and I am full of hope and optimism today because I'm choosing to be, because see, when we started reading Meccan Revelations by Ibn al-Arabi, also known as the Futuhat, or it could be said is a translation of the Futuhat or just Futuhat, I'm not sure, comment below. And so we started reading it and it was mind-blowing. It was like, wow. Some of it was like, wow, this is really ahead of its time. And some of it was like mind-blowing from like a mystical kind of like, whoa, this is deep, this is heavy, this is kind of like profound and thought-provoking. And then we got to the part where he talked for a very, 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 very long time about the Mahdi prophecy and the 9 traits of the helpers of the Mahdi, and that was less interesting. And we finished that section last time. And this next section is entitled something like Lesser and Greater Resurrections. So, your guess is as good as mine, and without further ado, I will begin reading this new section. I forgot to move the little thingy. Okay, this is the little thingy. Sometimes when I stop in the middle of a page, I put that there. Lesser and Greater Resurrection. So, of course, we're starting with the translators and editors explaining for a bit, just for a page, and then it'll get into some actual translation of Ibn Arabi, which is what we like. The explanation is all right. It's not bad or anything. It's just they read it and they're telling us what they read, and it's like, I wanted to read Ibn Arabi. I didn't want to read your summary of Ibn Arabi. You know what I mean? But it's like volumes and volumes. Would probably fill at least 2 shelves of this bookshelf behind me, and they've got it down into 2 volumes. So what can you do? All right. One moment. All right. Here we go. Without further ado. If all of Ibn Arabi's writing, parentheses, and the Futuhat in particular, end parentheses, can best be seen as a single vast commentary on the spiritual dimensions of the Quran and Hadith, nowhere is this more obviously the case than in his treatment of the elaborate eschatological symbolism to be found throughout those scriptures. But the role of those, quote, last, end quote, or ultimate things, especially in the Quran, is so fundamental and all-pervasive that even the most apparently mundane aspects of this worldly life are always viewed from within that eschatological, like religious. From what I understand, eschatological just kind of means like from within the religion, right? Editor Edward, back me up here. Eschatological, according to the Oxford Dictionary, relating to death, judgment, and the final destination of the soul and of humankind. And the brief blurb on Wikipedia: eschatology concerns expectations of the end of the present age, human history, or the world itself. Oh, now that snarky comment that Devar posted on my suggestion to do Peace in Jerusalem ritual on Golden Dawn Universum back in 2014 makes a whole lot more sense. No, it has nothing to do with eschatology. Though I admit there is a particular interest in, wanting there to be peace in that region, coming from a mystical Christian perspective, and its tie-in with the other Abrahamic religions, kind of wanting there to be peace in that family, of which at the time I considered myself a part. Not that I don't anymore, it's just that my sense of human spiritual family has grown beyond the Abrahamic since then. Anyway, that's the answer. Eschatological. End of the world shit. All right, there's the dictionary definition for you. Thanks, Editor Edward. Editor Edward, by the way, what are we listening to and where can we find more of it? That is a group called Majnun, performing for apparently a YouTube channel called Café de Anatolia. And that channel is right here. They've got lots of similar kind of arabesque, world fusion, sort of trancey type music. Thank you, Editor Edward. All right, where were we? Perspective. The mundane aspects of this worldly life are always viewed from within that eschatological perspective in the light of man's source with a capital S. Shout out to my Aquarian brethren, aunts and uncles mostly. Anyway, never mind. Pymanders, really. All right, anyway, source and destination of man's life in this, quote, nearer, end quote, or, quote, lower, end quote, world. For that life, truly perceived, is nothing else but man's, quote, return, end quote, to a full and awakened awareness of his primordial reality. Thus, quote, true faith in God and the last day, end quote, are repeatedly mentioned as the two essential and inextricable aspects of man's awareness of this comprehensive reality that already defines and constitutes each individual's metaphysical situation. The hundreds of Quranic verses alluding more specifically and vividly to the day of resurrection. Oh, all right. I'll keep my optimism. So we've moved beyond the apocalypse to the day of resurrection. All right. I'll keep an open mind. He's looking at, like, Kabbalah is kind of a particular interpretation, analysis, and lens through which to view the Tanakh and other Jewish scriptures. So perhaps there's a similar thing happening with Ibn Arabi and his perspective on these things. All right. The day of resurrection, the gardens of paradise, or the hellfires, and other torments of Gehenna are themselves only more particular reminders of this all-encompassing eschatological dimension of man's being. The extent to which this comprehensive metaphysical determinate eschatological perspective is also shared by Ibn Arabi, whose understanding of this aspect of the Quranic message, of course, builds on many generations of earlier Sufi, parentheses, and other less mystical, end parentheses, interpreters. Yeah, I kind of got that feeling that there was some less mystical interpretations in the previous several episodes of this, is perhaps most clearly revealed in the following key passage from one of his most accessible short treatises, the Risalat al-Anwar, in which, there's a footnote, and the footnotes are like in the back or something. I'm not going to go chasing for them. All right. In which the Shaykh outlines the fundamental, quote, realms of being, end quote, or spiritual and ontological, quote, homelands, end quote. Tomorrow episode 7 comes out. Okay, it's homeland. Sorry, got distracted. Yes, that together constitute the total field of being and experience of the perfect man. Okay, so this is Ibn Arabi. I don't know if this is from the Futuhat. This is from Risalat al-Anwar, which may or may not be like a chapter of Futuhat. I don't know because I don't want to look in the back. Quote, now these bracket parentheses ontological and bracket parentheses realms, although they are bracket parentheses quite and bracket parentheses numerous, come down to 6. The first is the realm of, quote within quotes, am I not your Lord? End quote within quotes, Quran 7, 172. And we have already become separated from it. The second is the realm of the, quote within quotes, lower world, end quote within quotes, in which we are right now. The third is the realm of the Barzakh, Quran 23, 100, to which we go after the lesser and greater deaths. The fourth is the realm of the raising, bracket parentheses, of the dead, end bracket parentheses, on the, quote within quotes, earth of the awakening, end quote within quotes, Quran 79, 14, and, quote within quotes, the return to the original state, end quote within quotes, Quran 79, 10. The fifth is the realm of the garden, bracket parentheses, of paradise, end bracket parentheses, and the fire, bracket parentheses, of hell, end bracket parentheses. And the sixth is the realm of the dune, bracket parentheses, of the, quote within quotes, visit, end quote within quotes, and beatific vision of God. Beatific, and bracket parentheses, outside the garden. Dune got a shout out. Cool. I knew he was hip. Okay, so we're back to the italics, meaning the Chodkiewicz and friends. Thus these last four, quote, eschatological, end quote, realms for Ibn Arabi, in fact constitute by far the greater part of manifest reality and potential experience, and for him their full spiritual apprehension, not as a theory or system of concepts, but through the profound inner, quote, realization, end quote, of their living presence accomplished by those rare souls, parentheses, and prophets, end parentheses, who have followed the spiritual path through to its end, is no doubt the most essential part of any true, comprehensive understanding of the nature of God and man. So it is not surprising if his initial, quote, systematic, end quote, discussions of each of those realms, parentheses, in chapters 61 through 65, and all of them together in the long chapter 371, end parentheses, far from being exhaustive, are in reality only a sort of preamble outlining the full range of scriptural indications and his personal principles of interpretation insights, that are subsequently actually applied, parentheses, and implied, end parentheses, throughout the Futuhat. In fact, as readers can easily verify, even within this anthology, almost every chapter of that work contains numerous allusions to this, quote within quotes, or no, quote, eschatological, end quote, realities, to the eschatological realities and dimensions of existence, and indeed from Ibn Arabi is often much more explicit. It's nice that I can read without the magnifying glass, but I'm like adding words and stuff, so I'll just use the magnifying glass. Is often much more explicit about the personal experimental aspects of his own eschatological insights and interpretations precisely in such otherwise unexpected contexts. Because the adequate translation and commentary of those few chapters alone would require a good-sized book, we have limited ourselves here to a representative selection of several shorter passages that do bring out quite clearly some of the essential themes and interpretive principles that appear and are applied in virtually all of Ibn Arabi's discussions of eschatological questions. In addition, given the importance of the, quote, other world, end quote, and afterlife in the Quran and Hadith as a whole, these readings likewise offer a superb illustration of Ibn Arabi's distinctive approach to understanding and interpreting Islamic scripture more generally. And finally, in light of the highly enigmatic character of many of those scriptural symbols in themselves combined with the even more problematic character, parentheses for the wider public at least, end parentheses, of any claims to know the true nature of the other world and what lies beyond the grave, Ibn Arabi's treatment of these eschatological questions raises to the greatest possible degree those complex issues of the saints' spiritual realization of these divine, quote, secrets, end quote, and their problematic written expression which he evoked in a critical passage of his introduction to the Futuhat as a whole. Now, there are three equally fundamental aspects, or, quote, levels, end quote, of Ibn Arabi's understanding of the scriptural symbols of Islamic eschatology, parentheses, both from the Quran and Hadith, end quote. 1. The, quote, literal, end quote, scriptural expressions and descriptions of those realities. 2. The, quote, microcosmic, end quote, aspect of their immediate experiential realization by each individual, whether in the initiatic, quote, voluntary return, end quote, the, quote, lesser death, end quote, or the, quote, obligatory return, end quote, shared by all men. And 3, the more complex, quote, macrocosmic, end quote, dimensions of that reality in terms of the other essential cosmological and metaphysical principles of Ibn Arabi's thought principles, of Ibn Arabi's thought principles, which for him are themselves likewise grounded both in revealed scriptural indications and in their corresponding personal spiritual realization and verification. But although these three basic interpretive dimensions can be described or analyzed separately, and indeed must be, for modern readers who are likely to be equally unacquainted with each of these perspectives, it is also true that in Ibn Arabi's own thought, they are ultimately inseparable aspects of a single unified vision, corresponding to the essential unity of the reality in question. However, as we shall see below, that comprehensive eschatological vision is intentionally set forth in such a way throughout the Futuhat that its unity and inner integrity can only become fully apparent to those devoted readers who are willing and able to undertake the difficult practical and intellectual efforts required to retrace the author's own footsteps. I hope that nobody's playing a drinking game where you take a shot every time I say eschatological, because that might be hazardous to your health. What do you think? You enjoying it so far? I was thinking in certain magical workings, is this thing on? In certain, you purify the space you're working in with water and fire, and there's like a few different ways you can look at that, but one particularly interesting way is that when you sprinkle water physically and astrally in the space, it gets rid of anything that is averse to the nature of water. So like fiery spirits are kind of like, I'm not into water. And then you go through with the incense, with the fire and air, and then the watery spirits are like, I'm not really into fire. And so then you're all alone. And then, you draw your circle and establish that I am alone here. Whereas what I do here on Chicken Philosophy is I read Meccan Revelations, so that anybody who's averse to the nature of Islam will be like, oh, I'm not really into this chicken philosophy thing. And then I read Christianity, so those averse to Christianity will be like, oh, I'm kind of uncomfortable here. And then Secret of the Golden Flower, so that anybody who's not into Eastern philosophy in general, or Chinese things specifically, will be like, I'm not really comfortable with all this. Or people who aren't into Martin Luther because they're uber Catholic, or people who aren't into the Catholicism because they're uber Protestant, or people who aren't into... You see what I mean? And then it assures that I am all alone here on Chicken Philosophy, which is exactly the way I like it. And further, when people see that I'm actually taking it seriously and not just mocking and criticizing it, they go, how can he take any of this seriously? And then when they see that I'm mocking and criticizing, they go, how come he's not taking it seriously? So it's just it's like a great filter that just filters out any possible, because, they always say if you want the channel to grow, which I don't, but if you did, then you should pick a thing and stick to it and do it every time, do it over and over. And, if you look like me, it helps to either be a racist asshole so that you'll get a large audience of racist assholes, or just stick to being like uber leftist woke, and then you'll get a moderate following of people who are like, it's good that he's using his platform to let people know about these important issues. Anyway, back to the 13th century Islamic, or 12th century Islamic studies. Where were we? I don't know. How the heck should I know? We were over on this page somewhere. Yes. To begin with, it must be stressed that Ibn Arabi's distinctive, quote, spiritual literalism, end quote, in his understanding of the language of the Quran and Hadith, whether with regard to eschatology or any other subject, is something quite different from those widespread, quote, and often largely, quote, fictional, end quote. Well, that's your opinion, Mr. Chodkiewicz. End parentheses, popular narrative and interpretive assumptions that underlie what are commonly taken to be the, quote, literal, end quote, meanings of these verses. For Ibn Arabi, the literal terms of the Quran, or Hadith in parentheses, putting parentheses in your own, this is the editor talking, so. Precisely are the fullest, most appropriate possible expression of the spiritual realities or intentions in question. As a result, his typical procedure of scriptural interpretation almost always assumes the closest possible attention to the exact Arabic language and precise context of the verse in question, to such a degree that, parentheses, as can be seen throughout this anthology, end parentheses, extensive background commentary is usually required to elucidate those specific linguistic and contextual elements in each interpretation. Thus, although the popular narrative connection and sequence of the eschatological, quote, events, end quote, and, quote, places, end quote, what are you implying with these quotes, Mr. Chodkiewicz? That it's not a real story about people in places? That it's not historical? It's interesting. So as we go along, we're starting to get to know Ibn Arabi, and also very much starting to get to know Michel Chodkiewicz. I mean, I have my spin on things when I recite Buddhist scripture, and I'm sure it's hard, if not impossible, it's difficult to be completely without any cognitive bias whatsoever. So I'm sure whatever cognitive biases I have seep in here and there. And if somebody did a careful study of it, they'd be like, okay, so Edward thinks this clearly. And maybe even, so when he started the project 2.5 years ago, he thought this way. And then gradually he started to change his... And so, anyway. Yeah, so this is what Michel thinks. All right, cool. A French guy thinks this about Ibn Arabi. Good to know. It's kind of like in Secret of the Golden Flower. Like, let's spend 5 episodes finding out what this Swiss guy and this German guy thought of the Secret of the Golden Flower in the 1930s before we get to the 17th century or 16th century Chinese text. What can you do? That's how it goes with books. All right, where were we? As a result, yes, where were the quotes? Places is assumed throughout chapters 61 to 65. That outline only provides the framework for further detailed discussions of particular verses and symbols scattered throughout the Futuhat, parentheses including the shorter passages translated below. And parentheses, below? Below. Oh, the original must have been a long scroll. So below, if you're on page 1, below could be page 100. Cool. They should have updated it when they decided to make it into a book with pages. It said later on in the book, or in the following pages, below. Anyway, sorry, just being a little bit silly. Yes, scattered throughout, including those translated below. Still another consequence of this approach is Ibn Arabi's strict focus on the Quran and Hadith to the exclusion of the further legendary embellishments and spectacular imagery that tended to predominate in the more popular later accounts. And finally, an equally essential facet of Ibn Arabi's approach to Scripture is his consistent focus on there's 2 entire pages of Michel talking about how we should think about Ibn Arabi's writings. Where all I want is to read Ibn Arabi's writings. But okay, all right, let's see. He probably went to college for this or whatever. So let's see what his professor told him to think, as he tells us. Anyway, profound spiritual and metaphysical dimensions of the eschatological reality, dimensions that are often obscured by the more obvious, quote, moralizing, end quote, and ethical aims that are the usual focus of attention in the popular depictions of paradise and hell, parentheses, whether in Islam or other religious traditions, end parentheses. A frequent consequence of this characteristic spiritual perspective is that it brings out the fundamental, quote, eschatological, end quote, meaning and import of many Quranic verses and incidents that would not ordinarily be seen in that light, at least in the popular imagination. The second essential aspect of Ibn Arabi's approach to Islamic eschatology, and one in which he, of course, builds on the insights and experience of many generations of earlier Sufis and Islamic thinkers, is his reliance on the personal realization of these, quote, eschatological, end quote, dimensions of reality by the saints and, quote, people of unveiling, end quote, already in this life. This microcosmic, quote, lesser death, end quote, parentheses, and concomitant spiritual rebirth. I think that probably means like what, it comes afterward, right? Fancy way of saying. End parentheses, or, quote, voluntary return, end quote, where they bodhisattvas, is at the very least a powerful prefiguration and confirmation of that, quote, lesser resurrection, end quote, which otherwise begins with each person's physical, quote, obligatory, end quote, death. The passages of the Futuhat selected below, after these, I'm on this page. By below, he means sometime after this page, because this is all italics here. All right, it's cool. Sometimes it's better to expect to be disappointed than you're not disappointed, right? Then you're like, this is what I expected. And then you can be pleasantly surprised if it's good. Where I, as you might remember, came in with hope and optimism. Now, I mean, I still have hope and optimism that after we're done with Michel's repeating himself over and over things that he's already said in previous pages, but applying it more specifically to this stuff, that we'll actually get to the translation and it will be good. Okay, so this whole thing is, this whole section is, all right, I'll finish this section of his introduction, and then next time we'll start a section that begins with his introduction, but does eventually get. So, in part 26, the first 7 minutes of the recital will be Michel Chodkiewicz. And then it'll be Ibn Arabi. And maybe it will be good. All right. So, for today, let's finish reading Michel's introduction to the section that we just started today, that we're not going to start today because we're just going to read the introduction. All right, I don't know. The music's good. Yes, right. The passages of the Futuhat selected below, from chapters 73, 302, 351, and 369, all tend to bring out this fundamental experiential focus on Ibn Arabi's eschatological thought. Of course, Ibn Arabi himself constantly refers as well to the many hadith and Quranic verses, example 44, 56 through 57, 39, 42, 2, 1, 54, etc., which provided the classical justification for, parentheses, and exhortation to, and parentheses, this more direct approach to the inner meaning of the symbols of the last day. The third, and probably the most mysterious and complex governing dimension of Ibn Arabi's understanding of Islamic eschatology is its, quote, macrocosmic and, quote, integration within the larger schema of his cosmological and metaphysical conceptions. Since his spiritual cosmology is itself likewise closely based on both the spiritual indications of Quran and Hadith and a corresponding experiential realization, but in this case expressed in terms of the accepted astronomical and cosmological theories of his day, it is often especially difficult for the modern reader to tell, in any given context, which one of those planes of reference is primarily in question, or in other words, whether allusions to that cosmology, example topics involving various astrological or cosmic cycles of time, are meant to be taken mainly as symbols, i.e. of some corresponding spiritual reality and experience, or as science. The ambiguities and uncertainties this creates become especially evident when one tries to reconcile or integrate what Ibn Arabi describes from this macrocosmic point of view with the relatively more familiar microcosmic perspectives and experience of the individual human being, and in some cases at least the resulting ambiguities are almost certainly intentional. In the selections translated below, for example, this interpretive problem is posed most frequently by Ibn Arabi's recurring contrast between the, quote, lesser resurrection, end quote, of the individual, parentheses, following immediately upon either his physical death or spiritual rebirth, end parentheses, which is the primary subject of those passages, and what he variously calls, without any further clarification here, the, quote, greater, end quote, resurrection, gathering, hour, reviewing, visit, etc. Now, in the popular, quote, exoteric, end quote, understanding of these Quranic symbols, such expressions would represent no real problem. The, quote, lesser resurrection, end quote, would be the period each individual spends in the, quote, tomb, end quote, until the day, parentheses, and hour, end parentheses, of the, quote, greater, end quote, universal resurrection, when all men are brought together before God in judgment. It sounds familiar from exoteric Christianity. This relatively straightforward temporal conception of the sequence of eschatological, quote, events, end quote, as we have indicated, is also largely assumed throughout the initial presentation of the spiritual descriptions of the eschatological realms in chapters 61 through 65. But elsewhere, most notably in his encounters, thank you, that was the best part of this, with Adam and Idris, It's not Adam and Steve or Adam and Eve. It's Adam and Idris. I don't know. During the autobiographical spiritual ascension described in 367 sections, Roman numeral 4 through B, or section Roman numeral 4b, and Roman numeral 4e of our translation here, Ibn Arabi indirectly suggests another rather different way of conceiving this relationship. There, Idris openly states that, quote, I do not know any period at the close of which the universe as a whole comes to an end, end quote. And he likewise indicates that since, quote, the abode of being is one, it does not become, quote, nearer, end quote, except through you. And the, quote, other world, end quote, is not distinguished from it except through you, end quote. The hour, in quotes, has perhaps already, quote, drawn near, end quote, to man ever since the very creation of Adam. Adam and Idris, all right. From this perspective, then, the relation of the lesser and greater resurrections, both lesser and greater in quotes, is not that of two different sorts of reality, but rather of the range of individual movements or partial perspectives within a much larger, all-encompassing whole with a WH. This possibility, which was, of course, expressed more openly by other Sufi, parentheses, and philosophic, end parentheses, writers, could be further corroborated by Ibn Arabi's many remarks in other contexts concerning the different meanings, psychic, spiritual, cosmic, etc., of, quote, time, end quote. However, this conception of the full range of eschatological reality as being potentially in direct relation to each soul is in itself less a, quote, answer, end quote, then a further opening, a point of view suggesting any number of possible conceptions of man's destiny, the true, quote, sights, end quote, of heaven and hell, and so on. Ibn Arabi's relative reluctance to more openly evoke those possibilities, parentheses, or realities, end quote, could be interpreted in several ways. See, I don't want to, spend the first half of the next episode reading Michel. So, and I also don't want this episode to be too much longer than 30 minutes. So if you're wondering why I'm reading so fast, it's because it's to indicate the value which I give what I'm reading as being less than that of Ibn Arabi. I'll slow down when Ibn Arabi is talking. And also because I want to finish this page in this episode today. All right. I have no idea where I was because I wasn't paying attention. In rather than answer, the further opening a point of view suggesting any number of possible conceptions of man's destiny, the true, quote, sights, end quote, of heaven and hell, and so on. Ibn Arabi's relative reluctance to more openly evoke these possibilities, parentheses, or realities, end quote, could be interpreted in several ways, as a realistic avowal of man's ignorance and uncertainty concerning such ultimate things, as a prudent concession to more orthodox opinion. I like that interpretation of the lame parts of Ibn Arabi, as he was just trying to keep his head on. That if he didn't stop and say, and that's why all this exoteric Islamic stuff, blah, blah, blah. Did they leave? Did they go? Okay, let's talk about the esoteric stuff. That's what I like to imagine. Then he can remain cool in spite of what he wrote in my mind. Okay, where was I? Yes. Or as the intentional concealment of those, quote, divine secrets, end quote. I think I might have that in common with Michel, actually. Is surpassing ordinary understanding and therefore reserved for the, quote, quintessence of the elite, end quote, which he mentions so pointedly at the very beginning of the Futuhat. Different time, quintessence of the elite, if it were a phrase that were coined or uttered or used in some kind of, conversation today, would probably be a negative thing and probably a comedically negative thing. But I think that this is neither comedic nor negative. It's positive. Elite is oh yes, the elite. The most holy, the most learned of men. People who we should all aspire to be. All right. Which he mentions so pointedly at the very beginning of the Futuhat. One more paragraph. In any case, Ibn Arabi clearly indicates to his more discerning readers that any satisfactory, quote, answer, end quote, to these further questions, any lasting resolution of this truly ultimate uncertainty is not to be found on the plane of concepts, parentheses, nor a fortiori. I wonder what that means, but I don't care. In an attitude of blind acceptance of traditional beliefs, end parentheses, but rather in that rare condition of inner openness and constant spiritual attention and practical effort, which, parentheses, as he describes it in section V below, or 5, end parentheses, is the distinguishing mark of the true, quote, knowers of God, end quote, those who have already, quote, visited the graves, end quote, that insistent openness to spiritual experience, parentheses, in each soul's ongoing inner dialogue with belief and the forms of revelation, end parentheses, so beautifully illustrated in each of the passages translated below, is one of the most characteristic features of Ibn Arabi's writing more generally, and a trait which at the same time strikingly distinguishes his work from that of so many of his commentators and predecessors, parentheses, whether they be Sufis, philosophers, or mutakalimun, end parentheses. All right. There you have it. Michel Chodkiewicz. He was, of course, the editor of this translation into French, which was later translated into English, apparently, of the Futuhat. Editor also because he decided which parts of the Futuhat should be included in these two books, and that's what he has to say about it. Next time on Meccan Revelations on Chicken Philosophy, we'll actually read some of the Futuhat, or the Meccan Revelations, by Ibn al-Arabi. So sorry for the bait and switch. You came for Ibn Arabi and all you got was Michel Chodkiewicz. If it's any consolation, I also had no idea that was what was going to happen. And Editor Edward, after that track that you told us about at the beginning ended, what did you play after that? I was lazy. I just looped it back around. It's the beginning of the same 34-minute track. Okay, I was just curious. All right. That's it for today. I hope you have a wonderful day. It's Wednesday. So I hope you have a wonderful second half of the week and weekend and all that. I hope you're staying cool if you're in one of the hot places, it being July and all. Keep an eye on the Esoteric Nerd podcast, because if all goes according to plan, Joe Zabinski and I, or BT, Joe Zabinski and BT, should be interviewing a guy on Saturday, so that episode might go up Sunday or Monday, the 14th or 15th of July, 2024. And I guess that's it. Until next time.